Hi everyone, my name is Leo, and if you follow our community you know that we have done several videos about latency. For instance, one video comparing 23 amp modelers, one specifically dedicated to the campaign player, one to the NAMP player, etc. This new video, as many of you have requested, is fully focused on the Helix Stadium latency management. First of all, if you want more info about the latency and how I have measured it, you can check out my 23 amp modeling pedalboard latency comparison video, following the link in the card above or in the description below. With this out of the way, let's jump straight to the results. With an empty chain, I mean no amp or cab or effect blocks in the chain, we have 2.2 milliseconds of latency. Then, if we add an amp block, the latency increases at 2.6 milliseconds, where with just a cab we have 2.4 milliseconds of latency. If we then use both the amp and the cab, the latency increases at 3 milliseconds. If we then add a tube screamer, the latency increases a tiny bit at 3.1 milliseconds. On the other hand, adding a delay or a reverb, or both together, the latency does not change. And this is of course a good news. Now let's talk about the external loops. And we have 4 mono loops or 2 stereo loops here. Of course, to make this test, I have jumpered the loops of the Helix. So if you add an external device in the loops, you should add its latency to the numbers. If we use the first loop, the latency rises at 5.3 milliseconds. Adding 2 loops, the latency goes at around 7.5 milliseconds. With all the 4 loops in the chain, in mono, we have around 12 milliseconds of latency, which is quite a lot. On the other hand, a stereo loop uses the same latency of the mono one. For instance, if we use the stereo loop 1 and 2, the latency is still 5.3 milliseconds, as of course the 2 loops that compose the stereo one are in parallel. So summarizing, with a simple chain with a tube screamer, an amp, a cab, a reverb and a delay, we have 3.1 milliseconds of latency, where if we add a loop we increase the latency of 2.2 milliseconds, reaching around 5.3, and so it does for every loop we add. Now, 3.1 milliseconds for a standard and I would say simple signal chain is not bad, but the top-notch devices in terms of latency are at around 1.2 milliseconds of latency, for instance like the Boss or the NAMP player or NUX devices. So, well, the values here in the Stadium are not so great, I would say, even because if you use the loops, we start to reach 5.3 milliseconds, which is a kind of an intermediate value to which we have to add the latency introduced by the external device, of course, where we want to add, reaching a value that could be felt by many of us. Once again, 3.1 milliseconds is not a bad value, but it is, I would say, mediocre. And honestly, from a plus 2,300 euros device, I would expect top-notch values. I expect best-in-class latency values at around 1 milliseconds. Of course, with firmware upgrades, the situation may improve, especially the one related to the amp and cab algorithms. But I don't think that the latency of the ADA round trip could be improved so much. And I mean, launching a device at this price point with these latency values, in my opinion, means that Line 6 probably does not care too much about latency, which is of course a priority choice that is totally legit by them. Please let me know your opinions in the comment section. That's all for this video and see you soon. Thank you so much for watching. Bye bye.